Well, and the rehearsal today, everything now is going to be exactly the same already. Now look to the left of the camera, so you can set your lights there.
One brief moment in my life, I worked in a factory as a summer job. And all the people at the factory did was look at the clock, waiting for it to get to 5 o'clock. Then they would go out the door. That was their life. It was just waiting to get out.
Yeah.
I can't wait to get in. I used to get up at 6:30 in the morning and go to my office because I loved it. Absolutely loved it.
Yeah. Lucky you, man.
Lucky me. That's one of my nieces. And there it is.
You can see.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles!
It just plays the song, you know. So.
Close your eyes and I'll kiss you.
Bring back
That's
memories.
fabulous. I love it. I do. I love it. I love it. And your little figures actually look like the Beatles. I mean, they really do. No, I'm super impressed.
Thank you.
And I like the concept of doing this as a historic piece. I think it's a remarkably good idea. I was born in New York City. Lived there until I was about 6, and then my parents thought it would be nice for me to be able to go out and play in a park or something without it being supervised.
Right.
So they moved to Hastings-on-Hudson, which by train is about 45 minutes north of the city. Both my stepmother and my mother were painters, and my father was primarily a commercial artist. He did billboards that went across the country and ads in the newspapers, things of that sort. I was the little Dutch boy for Dutch Boy Paint.
The little Dutch
For 7 years, he did the ads for Dutch Boy Paint. He also, my classmates in high school all loved me because they would come and pose for my father too and end up on billboards across the country. As they would drive across the country, they'd see themselves. So that cheered them up. But anyway, it was a wonderful existence. I went to MIT to be a nuclear physicist. I got there and I discovered that there were at least 6 people that were smarter than I was. And I didn't want to be a second-rate nuclear physicist. So I switched to architecture because I grew up with art, so I could draw, and I just wanted to get a degree.
Right.
So I stayed at MIT doing architecture. But at the same time, I loved acting. I used to do summer stock every year, and I also acted in theater around Boston and at Wellesley College, which is where I met my first fiancée, which it didn't work out, which was just as well because my second one became my wife, and we lived together for 52 years, so that turned out pretty well. I glued the acting and the architecture together and went to Yale Drama School for set design. And that turned out to be, again, part of my lucky life. Everything blended together exactly right. Because the background in architecture and acting, because I knew about theater, all worked perfectly at Yale Drama School. So I went to college for 8 years. I could have been a doctor and saved people's lives, but instead I amused them with pictures. But I had the best time you could imagine because I loved drawing pictures, and that's what I did. I did summer stock at a place called Tamiment, which was a Jewish summer resort that did variety show material, little skits and things of that sort. Woody Allen was one of the writers there at the time. We were all youngsters. I went to New York, had no idea how I was going to get my first job. I walked into my apartment in New York that I was sharing with another student from Yale Drama School, and he said, "You've had a call from CBS." I had no concept of how they would even know who I was. But it turned out that the costume designer from Talbot had gone in looking for work as a costume designer. The head art director at CBS hated her costumes, but loved the pictures of my sets in the background and wanted to find out who I was. So he tracked me down. I went in. First words out of his mouth were, "We have no jobs right now, but I wanted to meet you." But anyway, I showed him my portfolio and all. We had a nice session, and he really liked me, but there were no jobs. So I managed to get a job doing commercials in a house that was like a big warehouse, and all they did was commercials every day, all day.
Oh, wow.
And I did that for a year because it paid pretty well. Not great, but adequately. I had just gotten married. But after a year, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had people line up behind the camera and look through for every shot. You had the clients look through for every shot. And it took forever to get things done. And their main concern was move the Vitalis bottle 3 inches to the right, please. I mean, after a while, I couldn't take it.
Yeah.
So I quit cold. I called the art director from from the CBS, I should say, and said, "I'd like to come in 2 weeks' time so that I have time to update my portfolio, but can I come in 2 weeks' time?" We set up a meeting. He said, "Don't come in 2 weeks' time. Come in today. Because today is the last day we're seeing people to be an assistant designer on the Ed Sullivan Show. We've seen 15 people already, but today we have to make our decision." I went in, got the job, and it was wonderful. I went to work the next day, and the head art director at CBS pointed at me and said, "You're it." And I didn't know what that meant. Turned out that the art director on the Sullivan Show had gone into the hospital with a nervous breakdown. The reason they were looking for an extra assistant is he was getting stressed doing the show.
Wow.
And I ended up designing the Ed Sullivan Show, which at the time was the #1 show in the country, on my second day in television. And that's what got me started. And I spent the next 10 years designing the Sullivan Show.
Over those 10 years, I mean, first of all, it was a live show.
It was a live show, plus our season was 50 weeks a year. Like now it's about 15 or 16 maybe, but then it was 50 weeks a year.
So average per show, how many designs did you have?
About 6 sets a show. It was like doing a Broadway show
Right.
every week.
Right.
And I had 1 week to do it. We'd find out what all the acts were on Monday. On Tuesday, I would show them sketches, and they would say, "Okay, this works," and so forth. And so by Tuesday afternoon, they were starting to build the scenery. We had 50 carpenters at CBS in New York, so they built it. We had something like 30 painters. They would have to get it painted, and it would have to go out the door onto a truck on Friday afternoon. And it went out. We would set up that night. I would have assistants do a lot of the setup at the theater so I could at least have some sleep. And the next morning I'd go in and make sure everything was correct, and we would start rehearsing on Saturday afternoon.
Now, when you were given whatever artists were going to be on the show,
Right.
there was a variety show, so there were different types of
We
acts.
had jugglers, we had singers, dancers, ballet.
Yeah. And you designed all those sets?
I designed all those sets. I was getting to do a sculpture that was 50 feet wide, filled the entire stage, and somebody else was paying for it. So I was heaven for me. It was a joy because I could do anything. Ed Sullivan was in London and saw a crowd at the theater, at the airport, and there was this mob around a group of young men, and he couldn't figure out what that was, and he asked the questions, and it turns out it was the Beatles in London, and he thought, well, he'd hire them and brought them over to this country to be on his show, because Ed was not dumb about what should be on his show.
Right.
They came over, and we did talk a little bit. I watched them rehearse, and I designed the three sets that was going to be on the first show. And the first one was the arrow set that was in fact the first scene. I did a second set that was a forced perspective structure with slats on it, but the forced perspective again was pointing toward the Beatles, which is what I was attending. I did a third set which was simply a black background with the name Beatles on it, big huge letters.
Okay.
Ed came in to meet with all the reporters on Saturday morning, and he decided he was going to show the reporters who was boss, and he killed the set, threw it out, because he said everybody already knows who they are. So the set with the Beatles on it
I was
didn't
wondering,
exist.
because I've never seen
So I had two
Wow, okay.
two sets, but I also had backup sets that I used all the time. I had some just structural pieces that had curves and nice shapes to them. You put them together, and it would make a pleasant background.
Yeah.
So one of the first show sets that the Beatles were on was this made-up set, and then they also used the ceiling set, which was used, as you pointed out earlier, on their album cover, which made me feel
on
good.
something new. I think it's called something.
And the set that everybody remembers is the Arrow set.
Right.
And it was a joy doing it. There were 20,000 people in the street outside of the theater on the day we were going to have the Beatles on. They had all heard about it. A girl got arrested for trying to climb down the air conditioning set of our
Good idea, though, right?
of our theater. Another girl got arrested in the theater for masturbating with a Coca-Cola bottle while the Beatles were playing.
In the theater?
In the theater, in the balcony, and she was in love with the Beatles. So, but at any rate,
Okay. Float your boat.
the Beatles themselves were fabulous. They're just young kids, and they were very nice. They didn't seem very impressed with themselves at all.
Right.
They were just lovely people to have around. We did two shows in New York. We did the live show, and then we taped one on Monday night, done live essentially, but it was taped, so we could use it at another time. And then we all went to Florida to do a show there.
How many people from the crew? It was the Beatles and Ed Sullivan's crew?
And the crew, yeah, well, yes, the crew. And we all went to Florida. We warned the staff at the hotel that there was going to be a mob scene and they would have a lot of problem with it. But they said, well, we've handled this kind of thing before. We don't have to worry about it. So we all started to do the show live. Ed was announcing the first act will be the Beatles, and somebody signaled to him to say to go to commercial because the Beatles weren't in the room.
Oh, God.
We went to commercial. The Beatles couldn't get in the room because of the mob outside, and all these security people that told us they knew what they were doing couldn't get them inside. We went to commercial. Ed started to introduce them again, but this time, somehow or other, they got together formed a V with the Beatles inside. All guys hooking elbows together, formed a V and fought their way to get in. And just as Ed was saying, and here they are, the Beatles, they were coming into the room.
Wow.
Ringo had to climb up onto his platform to play his drums and so forth, but they were all literally picking up their microphones on camera, live, to start their act. But anyway, it all went fine. I went outside to go, the control room, in this case, was a truck outside. You know, that's how you would do remote shoots. And I went outside, and I was in the truck, and I looked out the door, and there was this wall of people coming around the side of the hotel. There were hundreds of people coming around. I thought they were going to knock the truck over. I slammed the door. I was standing behind the director and so forth. I very often stayed in the control room so I could offer opinions or mention that there was a piece of scenery falling down, they could call the stage manager to stand it up, that kind of thing. So I always had a good relationship with the directors. But this wall of people came and they'd hit the truck we were in, and the truck was shaking like this. We were convinced that somebody was going to get electrocuted because you have 1,000 wires coming to this truck.
Wow.
And we were very worried. But somehow we got the show done, went on the air live, and you couldn't tell at home that the truck was shaking, but we sure could tell sitting there. So then after that, we all went to dinner together. Ringo was sitting next to me, and he said something that I found remarkable in a very young man. He turned to me, and said, "I'm kind of sad right now." And I said, "Why in the world would you be sad?" And he said that no matter what happens after this, it's never going to be as good as this. This has got to be my best moment in life. And this is Ringo at a very young age being able to realize that.
I designed I don't know if you can see this, but this piece here, based on Bill's original, the first set that the Beatles ever were on in America.
Correct.
On Ed Sullivan in February of 1964.
Glad you can remember the date.
I was born in 1964 in December.
Wow.
What about the actual Aero stage? Because it was so interesting how it kind of looked suspended. I know it was suspended. Were there wires? Or
Well,
how were the
every
arrows
theater,
done?
it was a Broadway theater that we were in, so it had a flying system. You had pipes with lines going up on pulleys, and people at the side could pull them up or down. So
Come here, sweetie.
she's trying.
That's Minnie Bones.
She can open the door.
This is Minnie Bones. She's very smart.
The scenic pieces, the arrows, particularly the ones that are angled like this, flew out straight up and down. But when they were on the show, once they'd flown in, they pushed forward so that the point of the arrow touched the ground. The rear part was held up by the wires up above.
Right.
So when we struck the set, it would just all fly up. The other pieces were either carried in and put. We had a crew, a stage crew of about 20 guys, and I must say, unlike most set crews, these guys actually wanted to do a good job. We had to change sets. We had to go from a full orchestra on stage to a stand-up comic standing in one, and while the comic was working, they had to set the whole stage over again. They'd have to get the orchestra off. They would have to put the other set pieces on, all in about 6 or 7 minutes' time. It was a race, but these guys took pride in the fact that they could do it.
What brought you here?
Okay, what brought me here was the need to make a living. Was doing the Ed Sullivan Show in New York as the designer for 10 years. It went off the air, and I got a job doing the sets for the Electric Company, which was a children's show, and it had Bill Cosby as one of the actors, and Bill Cosby got offered a show on the West Coast to come out and do a variety show. Well, I thought, should I come to the West Coast with Bill Cosby, or should I stay on the East Coast doing the Electric Company? But it was cold, wet, and dreary, and I decided to come out here. So that's what brought me here. People from the Sullivan Show were all out here.
Yeah.
They were established. They'd been here for a year. The producer of the show, Bob Precht, who is the most wonderful person in the world, by the way. But at any rate, he was producing award shows. So I got to do the Emmys, the Grammys, the Golden Globes, the Country Music Awards, a whole bunch of award shows.
Wow.
The director was doing variety shows. An agent remembered me. This is like 7 years after the Sullivan Show went off the air. He called me up because he remembered me from the Sullivan Show and asked me if I'd do the Donnie and Marie Osmond Show. So I mean, it's just one. I never had to look for work. There was a Christmas special that I did with the Muppets. I worked with the Muppets quite a lot.
Did you?
And yeah, they were on the Sullivan Show a lot, and we did a Christmas special one time with the Muppets. Had an interior of a cave, but all the stalactites and stalagmites had to be designed so a Muppet could be, Muppet operator could be inside. The Muppets were fabulous to work with, I must tell you.
Was it Jim Henson and Frank Oz, or was
Yes, exactly. And Jim Henson was one of the nicest people I've ever met. Jim Oz was also the same way. Years later, I was doing an award show on the West Coast, and Jim Henson was there, and we did a little memory work together. And he offered me a job on a new show he was putting together, which I turned down, as it turned out, because it was not the kind of thing I liked to do. It was on film, and I hated working on film. When I was starting out, you couldn't, there wasn't a video picture from the camera, it was only film. So if you wanted to see what the cameraman was seeing, you had to get the cameraman to move out of the way, bend down, look through the lens, and it was an endless process, which I hated. Whereas live television, you saw instantly what was going on. And I would literally stand behind the director. We would discuss what I had planned, and the director would follow my plan most of the time. And it was a very easy combination. The lighting was all done like it was done in the theater. It was done by a whole other person, but he didn't control what shots were done.
Right.
And we would always consult about what I wanted lit and so forth.
Yeah, because I love the way I noticed on the Arrow set that it's lit from behind and the back underneath, and then it was lit from the top, and it just really...
And I would design scenery very often with beveled edges. So if you cross-lit them, it would light up the edges. And you really see the shapes there, and that kind of thing. So I had studied lighting at Yale. I also studied costume design, but set design was what I wanted to do.
And then you continued your career until you were
76.
So
I worked literally 50 years in television. During the latter part of my career, I started using a computer program called Maya. And Maya is a wonderful thing in that you can build three-dimensional models in the computer.
right.
You can turn them around, you can place them however you want to. You can light them, just like you're on a stage. You can set camera angles, the whole deal. So it was a wonderful way to design. Eventually, originally I did watercolor pictures or pencil drawings of my sketches, of my sets. But now I could show a picture that looked exactly like it was going to look like on stage. Once I retired, I started using it to build sculptures. And I started doing, I think, maybe my first sculpture was that little castle that you saw over there.
Yeah, I love that.
And then I did all these other kinds of sculptures. Like, here's the Taj Mahal. But I do...
These little guys with the robots.
And the little robots climbing up and down the stairs, and a whole raft of materials. I don't even have a clue as to how many sculptures I've done. I'm slowing down because I have no place to put them.
If you could change something right now in the world to make it better, what would it be?
Unfortunately, the first thing that comes to mind is to lose Mr. Trump.
Ah, okay. Yeah, we're all like, okay. I think we have a lot of people with you there.
One of my lady friends was remarkable in that she was very much involved in politics. She was the chief fundraiser for Ronald Reagan and worked for the Republican Party for many, many years, raising money. She no longer does that because of Mr. Trump and what he stands for. And she can't believe what's going on in the Senate right now. But all of these Republicans are just standing behind Trump with everything. And it just, she stopped raising money for the Republican Party. For a long time, she was one of the major fundraisers for the Republican Party. She hasn't raised a dime.
Yeah. You know, Republican, Democrat, Independent, alien, whatever. It's like, I think we're all aliens, but that's a whole other show. That's a whole other thing. So, you know, I think there's a place for us. And when you tell me that about this woman, this friend of yours, that, you know, that she's doing that, it gives me hope that on either side that we can keep our minds open. That people think independently, and we have open minds. You know, I still have hope for humans.
Good for you. I'm waiting for the aliens, however, because I figure they'll
too.
come in with better judgment.
Me too. I actually did a video on that. I'll show you. Thank you so much for letting us come into your home and, you know, invade your and meet your dog and take pictures of your stuff.
No, I'm delighted to have it. I love the conversation.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much for just, you know, all of the years that you've created and you've kept doing it. And, you know, just as far as that goes, do you mind me telling people how old you are?
No, of course not.
So you are 87, right?
I'm 87.
87 years old. And you have a good life. You love your life.
I have a fantastic life.
You retired because at a certain age, we all know that, you know, the phone stops ringing, as you said.
Particularly in show business.
Right, right. And those of us who love what we do and maybe don't do it, we do it because we love to do it, still have beautiful, ongoing, creative lives. And you're an example of that. That's an inspiration to people, because I think sometimes people think, oh my God, what's going to happen when my career's over? If you love what you do and you're doing it, you know, for whatever reason,
For joy. I like
Yay, joy.
being creative.
Yeah.
There's no question about it.
Right.
I love putting
Right.
things together.
Right. And that never has to go away. You
No,
know?
it
and,
doesn't.
And you can continue to
And
make
planning
these
to live to
beautiful
be
things.
100, so
Yeah, there you
I
go.
got stuff to do.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're
Thank
very,
you
very
so
welcome.
much. All right, that wraps it up.
That's what keeps you alive.
I agree.
And
I agree. That and crossword puzzles.